My name is John Massingale, and I have to do a little housekeeping first. This session has been approved for 1.25 AIA and 1.25 AICP, continuing education credits. And you can sign, there's a form in the back of the room to get those. So this is Global Capitalism and the Tall Tower Reconsidered. This is a Financial Times ad that you may have seen in airports around the world, and we might talk about this a little more after the... We might talk about this, can you hear me now? Might talk about this more after the three presentations. This is Rem Koolhaas's version of the same Financial Times slide. And our three speakers today are Vishan Chakrabarti. Vishan is the Holiday Professor of Real Estate Development and the Director of CURE at the Graduate Architecture School at Columbia. He's a new partner of Shop Architects in New York, and he's a former Executive Vice President of Design and Planning for the related companies, and a former Director of the Manhattan office for the New York City Department of Planning. Jamie von Klemperer is Design Principal at Kohn Pedersen Fox. I only have one bullet point for Jamie, but that's because he's so busy for the last 20 years designing buildings and cities around the world. And Stefanos Polyzoides, who of course is well known to this audience. He's one of the founders of the CNU, a partner Moule and Polyzoides, Professor Emeritus at USC, and co-author of the Canons for Sustainable Architecture and Urbanism. So, without further ado, let's go in that order and start with Vishan Chakrabarti. This one? Yep. And...
Oh, actually, no, that's Jamie's. Sorry.
Jamie has big images.
This thing that happens in the Mac, my 10-year-old calls it the spinning beach ball of death.
Still the spinning beach ball. So this one.
Yeah, it's that one. It's that one.
I thought that's the one we just did. No.
I think you'd already hit it.
Jamie's was already open. That's why.
No, it's still opening, Jamie's. No, there's mine. Okay, thank you. Jamie, this was working fine before. What have you done? What have you done? How big are your files? Well, this is, well, the spinning beach ball of death is spinning. Hopefully it'll come to life. Thank you for having me here today. So as John mentioned, I'm a professor at Columbia University and running the real estate development program there, an architect by training, and also a partner at Shop Architects. And we have created a research center at Columbia called the Center for Urban Real Estate, or CURE. And that acronym, oh, there's Jamie's again. Sorry. Okay, so let me, okay, so let me see if I can just, so it stopped doing that.
So yours is underneath.
Mine's underneath, so if I can click on it, then we can get going.
you want me to click on it while you talk?
It just doesn't want to do it. Ah, there we go. Sorry, everyone. We created this thing called CURE because we fundamentally believe that cities, and big cities, represent the silver bullet, the single biggest cure that we have to the economic, environmental, and equity problems that we're confronting in this country and in this planet today. And we operate from a single, rather extreme premise. And it's extreme to be purposefully kind of provocative, right? Which is to say that if you really love nature, if nature is so important to you, then don't try to live in it, right? As a fundamental precept. And we come at this with the notion that, and I'm going to talk a lot about New York today, but I'm actually going to try to keep it in the context not just of New York, but of big cities, both in this country and around the world. Many of you probably read a lot of the hand-wringing about the fact that we've approached now 7 billion people on this planet, born, the 7 billionth baby born probably somewhere in my home country of India or somewhere in Africa. And a lot of consternation about this, and the fact that by the year 2100 we'll probably peak out at about 10 billion people. And people call that a crisis. I actually don't think it's necessarily a crisis. At New York City density, which is not to say Manhattan density, but all 5 boroughs of New York, everything from single-family homes to row houses to skyscrapers, all 7 billion people would fit in the landmass of Texas. By the time you hit that 10 billion by 2100, everyone would fit in Texas and New Mexico, so there'd be a blue state and a red state. But my point is not that maybe there's not a population crisis, but a crisis of imagination. And that crisis really sits at this problem, our most lethal global export at this point, and a problem that is not going away anytime soon in terms of the enormous economic, environmental, and equity consequences of deciding to live this way. And the fact that this is not something that was market-driven. This is a byproduct of big government and a whole set of social and moral justifications that led us to this state. Now, John asked me to not talk too much about things that probably most people in this room agree upon, so I'm going to try to focus on maybe on places where there's maybe a bit more controversy. As most of you probably know, this is the work of the Regional Planning Association in New York, and they talk about these mega regions and the fact that about 70% of the United States population lives in those colored zones. Most of those gray zones are losing population. And this is a huge political problem for us because, of course, political representation is very evenly spread in the geography of the country, despite the fact that those corridors, like the Char-Lanta corridor, for instance, needs its own kind of governance to get the things that it needs, like high-speed rail and so forth. But this focus on regionalism, which we're seeing coming out of Brookings and a number of other places, I think is also a bit worrisome in my mind. And that's because it confuses the definition of city. So I want to be very clear about what definition I'm trying to use today. And you may disagree with this, about what a city is, right? Because we keep hearing this statistic that more people live in cities or urban areas than rural areas. I don't think that's true. I don't think the world's actually urbanizing. I think the world is suburbanizing, right? And that to me, this notion of putting everything into a metropolitan region confuses this. I think somewhat purposefully confuses this. And so I want to use a very sort of strict definition, which is that I believe a city is a city is only a city if it's dense enough to support heavy rail mass transportation, a subway, right? Now, various studies have been done on that. In 1977, there were studies done that said that that's 12 to 50 units an acre. New York, some of New York's densest blocks are about approaching 500 units an acre. But clearly, you need a very significant amount of density to support the investment of heavy rail mass transit. Now, why am I so focused on heavy rail mass transit? Because we keep hearing this stuff about walkable urbanism, right? Bethesda. And I don't know why Brookings is so fascinated with Bethesda. My sense is that maybe a lot of people live there, right? But my sister lives there. I watch Bethesda quite a bit. Everyone drives everywhere. It doesn't matter that there's a metro. It doesn't matter that there's, you know, a main street with a couple of stores on it. The vast majority of a place like Bethesda, Maryland, is single-family homes, and everyone drives to get a cart of milk, and at 8:30 in the morning you see a parade of minivans driving a bunch of chubby kids to school a half a block away. That's the reality. It is not a walkable place. And so I want to be very clear about this topic of the conversation for this session, because I hear some give and take about towers and the role towers play. But in the American political scene, at the national level, if you don't like towers, this is your guy. Right? He's made a statement very clearly. This quote, which I won't read, but he talks about how people who live in high-rise apartment buildings, and they usually write for fancy newspapers, because, you know, most journalists, of course, can afford luxury condominiums in the heart of cities. But that they, you know, these journalists, they don't understand the amazing moral imperative it is for Americans to live in single-family housing. So this is your guy if you don't like towers, pretty clearly. This is my guy. I have a lot of faith in this man, although there are disappointments. This is his first State of the Union address, where he called for building the infrastructure of tomorrow. And he says there's no reason Europe or China should have the fastest trains. The next day, Vice President Biden announces high-speed rail. And where does he announce high-speed rail? Between Tampa and Orlando. Ludicrous on its face, no mass transit connections into those high-speed rail stations, and virtually no time savings between taking that high-speed rail and driving. Of course, that money was ultimately rejected by the Tea Party governor that came in. That money was supposed to help build one of the nation's most critical infrastructure projects, the ARC project, a new tunnel under the Hudson. If you're familiar with high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor, there are two big bottlenecks, one in Baltimore, one under the Hudson River, and then Governor Christie came along and killed this. This is the state of infrastructure construction in this country. It is abysmal compared to the rest of the world. And instead, what I find amazing is that progressives are fully distracted by, you know, I mean, we love this guy on this bicycle in Copenhagen, right? I mean, look, he's a locavore, and he, you know, rides a bike to work. You know, when you come from a city of 8 million people, the notion that this is going to have any impact on modal split is completely asinine. It's a distraction. It's a lovely thing in a small place. It has nothing to do with how people move around very large cities. This is the reality of New York. It is not the reality of a place like Denmark. All of Copenhagen has about 3.5 million people in it. New York has 8. It's a polyglot city. It's a culture of congestion, as Rem Koolhaas wrote so eloquently about. And so we need to find real solutions for a place like that, because we sit in a very, very fierce world of global competition as New Yorkers. In Fareed Zakaria's book, The Post-American World, he writes extremely intelligently about this and says that we are consumed in the news cycle with things like terrorism and swine flu, when in fact the number one issue we have as a planet is the fact that we have 2 billion people approaching the middle-class living standards that we have in the United States. And the resource implications of that are absolutely enormous. He calls it the rise of the rest. In many ways, he says it's very positive. Global poverty has declined dramatically in the last 15 to 20 years, but with it comes an enormous set of constraints on natural resources that demand infrastructure investment. And of course, where's that investment happening? It's happening in places like China, with a high-speed rail that would bring you from New York to Charlotte in 3 hours. And of course, we were told that high-speed rail would never work in a geography like the United States, and yet China's geography is not that dissimilar in terms of the size of the landmass. And of course, this is a train station in that part of the world. In Hong Kong, in Kowloon, my friends at KPF actually designed this. And of course, you arrive at that train station, which is absolutely appropriate because that's where the density should be. And then you switch to a metro line, and if you've been on New York subway system, it looks nothing like this as it moves you onto Hong Kong Island. And then Hong Kong itself, one of my favorite places in the world, which people have a full misunderstanding of, because about 66% of Hong Kong Island is not developed. It is natural land. Hong Kong is actually a city of hikers and a very beautiful, very natural city. And it sits in this condition of these density extremes of either tall towers or almost wild nature, all cohabitating. People ask me if there's density I don't like. This is density I don't particularly like. I was raised as a skyscraper architect. I don't understand the notion of skyscrapers in places where there's vast amounts of land surrounding you. And that land, if you fly over it, looks increasingly like this. This is the scariest slide I will show you today. This is essentially the biggest, as I said, export that we've given to the world. And the notion whether this is on the outskirts of Phoenix or the outskirts of Riyadh doesn't really matter. The notion that you would subdivide this, put single-family homes, irrigate lawns, have housing with air conditioning, to me is completely asinine and threatens the lives of all of our children and grandchildren. It also sets up a world of enormous political turmoil that we're now seeing unfolding in the Middle East, and of course gives us this very unwelcome sky above the World Trade Center site that happened to our city on 9/11. All of these issues, in my mind, are intensely related, and they are all completely tied to our SUVs and our single-family homes. Now, New Yorkers, as hopefully most of you know, you have about a third less of a carbon footprint than the average American. This is not because we're saints. It's not because we use fluorescent light bulbs. It's because we ride the subway and we live in apartments that heat and cool each other. And it's been that way long before the green movement started. And then moving from environment to the economy, an extraordinary study was done in the University of Chicago that basically found that 50% of the gross domestic product of this country, half of this country's economic output, is generated by 2% of its landmass. And in New York City, annually, we generate $1.5 billion of the US GDP per square mile. Of course, economist after economist has been studying this today. Ryan Avant and the fact his studies about what it means to double density and the productivity rates that come from the doubling of density. To Ed Glazer, who I know has spoken here in the past, who writes in his book not only about the economic benefit of density, but the enormous data that's coming out about the quality of health and joy that comes from living in dense urban environments. So that is what we need to think about when thinking about places like the Northeast Corridor, which is about 50 million people by 2050. And what is amazing to me about a place like the Northeast Corridor is there are 36 daily flights a day between New York City and Philadelphia. No developed nation in the world lives like this. It's crazy. And this is only, this situation is only getting more and more exacerbated as we see the growth of the New South. There's 1 million air passengers annually between Charlotte and New York City, between Atlanta and Washington, D.C. We have to have a different way of doing business. I overlay here, actually with the help of my friends at KPF, the map of Japan and Japan's high-speed rail network on the Northeast Corridor, and you see how similar that is in landmass with a high-speed rail system that was built the year that I was born, which unfortunately was quite a while ago. So we talk about density and we talk about infrastructure, and we have to figure out how density helps us pay for infrastructure. Dan Doctoroff, our former deputy mayor, had a cycle that he called the virtuous cycle, and he basically said that happiness is a function of the fact that the marginal revenue of an additional New Yorker is greater than the marginal cost of that additional New Yorker, that they actually bring more economic development than they cost at tax revenue. And so therefore, our competitiveness as a city is a function of our growth, that growth of New York City is inherently good from an economic and environmental standpoint. This is why I believe planning commissioners of the big cities around the world, someone like an Amanda Burden, is actually, so if you take those 10 planning commissioners and multiply their power, that zoning power is actually more important in my mind than fiscal policymakers. Sorry. So because in New York, we still have this condition where we've had an extraordinary planning apparatus under the Bloomberg administration for the last 10 years. They've created a plan that projects our growth in the next, by 2030, by about 11%, by about 1 million people. The problem is the region's growing at twice that rate as suburban sprawl. So even if we're planning for growth, we're still losing the battle regionally. So I'm going to sort of try to walk you through 5 recommendations for how to deal with that issue. First is to deal with real hyperdensity, 30-plus floor area ratios and state-of-the-art buildings in our rail hubs. Our predecessors knew how to do this when 100 years ago they built not only Grand Central Station, but those development sites over the tracks of Park Avenue that would become, inside of 3 decades, some of the most valuable and productive real estate in the world. New York is trying to do this today. We have more infrastructure construction underground than we've had for 100 years in terms of subway, water, and other infrastructure, including a new subway extension that I worked on while I was at the city that is paid for by tax increment financing of this new area called Hudson Yards, about 60 city blocks that we rezoned in 2005 to accept about 40 million square feet of mixed-use development, a city about the size of Seattle on those 60 blocks on the west side of Manhattan, including Hudson Yards being developed by the related companies, being those 2 towers being designed by KPF, right at the heart of that mass transit. Secondly, to zone for dense, affordable housing and new businesses to create essentially a city of cities. We still have an inequity problem in our city, even though we build more affordable housing a year than the entire state of California. This is a critical issue because this at least was a nation of immigrants, accepted my family in 1968 to Tucson, Arizona. I'm the weirdly dressed kid and being held by my father there. But the issue for a city like New York is how immigration continues to be something that is an extraordinary generator of our productivity. So the city has taken great steps. John mentioned I'm a partner at Shop Architects. Shop is actually designing this 900-unit, again, transit-oriented, affordable mixed-use housing complex on the Queens waterfront. We're also going to build the tallest modular building in the world with modular construction that's being done prefab out in downtown Brooklyn. Again, in Brooklyn's major transit hub, 12 subway lines meet here. Thirdly, to build for livability. And so this means to build the kind of open space and the kind of attractive uses that Jane Jacobs wrote about. Many of you, I'm sure, have read about or have even walked on the High Line. What people probably don't realize about the High Line is not just an extraordinary park, but an extraordinary act of neighborhood creation that came from a rezoning that essentially allowed residential development to occur on the avenues. This is a sort of typical cross-section through that part of the city. So those yellow buildings are new affordable new residential buildings, and then transfers FAR from around the High Line to the buildings on 10th and 11th Avenue. That is resulting in extraordinary architectural experimentation, as well as one of the city's most beloved parks and something that's of international acclaim, but also a great new neighborhood. Shop is designing the East River waterfront in terms of making the city more livable, and a whole set of waterfront esplanades and piers. We're also designing the new Barclays Center, a new arena that's next to that housing I showed you earlier, which is really, it's coming up right now. I was just talking to a colleague about how none of the renderings do this justice in terms of how beautiful it really is. And that kind of effort of new entertainment, new waterfronts, new parks isn't just about creating a more livable city for its residents today, but to attract new young people and new creative culture and technology to our city. The city has made this great effort to bring Cornell's campus to Roosevelt Island right off of Midtown. And that is a very sound policy in terms of the data that we've discovered about how patent intensity and creative culture actually does build with density. And this is why Columbia's campus is expanding by about 6 million square feet, NYU's campus by about 2 million square feet downtown. And so we have this new creative culture that's being built around that livability. The next is, how do you make this all green? And this is not just a question of the architectural solutions of things like double-skin curtain walls on office buildings, but also entire systems, performative parks, large parks that process rainwater, this whole notion of dealing with solid waste in a different way, and there are tube systems that actually have a history of being built in New York City that are being looked at in other parts of the city, including Hudson Yards. Of waste to energy, we have one of, our city is actually pretty close to a nuclear power plant that's operating today, and we need to find new ways of generating electricity for my kids' iPhones and iPads. And then fifth, to build a more resilient city. And many people have criticized large, dense cities, especially that sit on waterfronts, in terms of how vulnerable they are in terms of sea level rise. And it is a real issue. This is a picture that I took during Hurricane Irene. And it was a pretty scary moment. Our apartment was actually evacuated during that hurricane. And it was interesting. It's interesting to see how the landscape architecture profession has really led the way and talked about the use of dredge materials to create softer edges to help absorb the blow of sea level rise. And what we did at Columbia is we did a study with my colleague Lori Hawkinson, and we looked at how historically Manhattan is actually about 10% landfill. Especially lower Manhattan has grown tremendously out to its current water's edge. And yet a lot of that landfill sits in the FEMA 100-year plain. So a lot of this waterfront development that I've been talking about sits right in the floodplain of New York City. And we looked at Governor's Island, which in that slide is floating out there out in New York Harbor. And we looked at the amount of dredge material that the Army Corps is actually pulling out of the harbor today. It's an extraordinary amount of material. And realized that rather than ship that material off to landfills in Texas and in Pennsylvania, that we could use it to actually connect, and this is a somewhat theoretical project, to connect Lower Manhattan to Governor's Island and actually create not just a new neighborhood with new transportation and so forth, but create a series of barrier islands that would help protect Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn from sea level rise. Whether this happens or some other form of architectural intervention happens, I believe in the next 100 years, as a harbor city, we are going to have to intervene physically in our harbor to deal with sea level rise, just as Rotterdam has in other cities. Tokyo and Hong Kong are using landfill in very sophisticated ways to deal with this issue. And so we were trying to encapsulate a bunch of issues like waste to energy and other things as we talked about expanding Manhattan. And that's a picture of it looking from the north. And the idea is that more Manhattan actually gives you more economic and environmental resilience, because we're building upon our core strengths as a city and as a region in terms of our importance to the national economy. So at CURE, at the Center for Urban Real Estate, we're actually looking not just at those more theoretical ideas like that landfill project, but where more density can go around transit hubs in New York City. We're looking at things like cap and trade zoning, like that Highline FAR mechanism, where, you know, planners tend to like tall buildings next to tall buildings, medium buildings next to medium buildings. I always joke my wife's about a foot shorter than I am. We're doing just fine, even though we're next to each other. That, you know, the buildings can be mixed up and actually have the light and air that one finds in places like London, where you have tall buildings juxtaposed to medium and small buildings. My last slide is to now move out of New York and back into the national arena, which I know is the concern of much of this conference. Is I believe that we have to take things like the transportation bill and fundamentally think about how we do urban development and build infrastructure in this country differently. So I'm writing a book actually called The Country of Cities, and in it I talk about enacting a new bill called ASIA, the American Smart Infrastructure Act, acronymed so we can look to our brethren in Asia, who I think have some more answers and better answers than what we're doing in terms of urban development. And to do a series of things, to basically strip away the subsidies that fuel suburban development. And by saying that, I'm actually not saying that I think the suburbs should be illegal or that we should ban them. But there are studies that say that if you paid for the true environmental and economic costs of gasoline, that gasoline would be $10+ a gallon. Right? And so if you stripped away all the subsidies that the federal government has built up since World War II, that I believe, and you see this in the data, that people would move towards multifamily housing, people would move towards towers, people would move towards mass transit, because people fundamentally vote with their wallets. And if you look at the landscape of foreclosure today and the landscape of unemployment today, it is all the areas where we've let density wane and we've created auto-oriented culture. So I believe we can basically redirect those funds and that fifth bullet to use it to fund high-speed rail, fund mass transit, green waste, water, and energy systems built around the largest cities in America, and that's where I believe our core resources should be going. Thank you very much. I'm not touching that computer.
Yours right there.
Easy, yeah. Right. Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some physical objects of density, something perhaps a little bit easier to grasp than and less ambitious in scope than what Vishan was talking about, but nonetheless quite relevant as John started today showing you the FT banner. I'm not sure who organizes this grouping, but we haven't succeeded in getting, as KPF, a building into this collage, even though we've designed a few tall ones. But maybe that's a good thing. We haven't then been the objects of attack, or won't be, for Rem Koolhaas. And I think Vishan's talked enough about this, about the background of density and of environmental efficiency of cities. But I should just mention, since some of the work that I will show is tall building work in Asia, that Hong Kong does serve us as a remarkable example of one of the lowest carbon footprints per capita, mostly due to the tight grouping of buildings, and some of that has to do with the topography, and of course quite a bit less of the use of the automobile. Now, when we started talking about this panel, John Massengale mentioned something about Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. Jane Jacobs being perhaps more sensitive to some of the textural issues of the city, and Robert Moses, the practitioner of the performative engine of New York. And I want today to, in showing you 5 projects, to talk about those issues that Jane Jacobs might be concerned about, interested in, or want to talk about in some of the tall buildings that I'll show you. These 8 skylines coming down from top to bottom, starting the left, of London, Paris, New York, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tokyo, Seoul, and Singapore, are, of course, the kinds of settings where the high-rise practitioners' work is to be found, and it happens KPF has established one of those tentpole top dominating buildings in each case. So I think we're qualified to talk about these city centers at the point of the physical manifestation of the tall building. So in talking about these 5 examples, I want to bring up, use each one to bring up an example of a set of issues that I think some in the room are concerned about, and certainly the kind of thing that Jane Jacobs would investigate or want to just bring to discussion for these buildings. So the first building is a building in London, which from early ages, of course, with whether it's Christopher Wren steeples or other periods of church building, has used the tall structure as a way to pronounce and define space and order. And today that's being taken, as most of you know, quite a bit further with Peter Rees's developments or entitlements and approvals of tall structures, many of them under construction in the center of the city, the square mile of London. So we have the Shard under construction, we have the walkie-talkie, and so on, all a question really of making London more competitive, as it is already one of the 2 leading market and trading centers of the world. So in the center of this, you see the building with the sort of truss work on the side is a building known as Heron Tower, which is a KPF design. And it sits not too far from the Gherkin. In the distance, we can see Canary Wharf, which one could argue after the Great Bang in London, the Big Bang, allowed for the competitiveness of commodity trading, stock trading, IPOs, etc., to stay in London because the city could not accommodate that size floor plate. Today, there is a move back in the other direction to bring density and larger scale buildings into the city of London and some of the other sub-boroughs of London. But the issue of scale then is quite a serious one, both to find sites that can work, but also to craft, articulate, and design the buildings at their tops and their bases that make sense. And in the context of a city which is largely Victorian, but of course much older. In this case, you see how the truss work of this slightly metabolic design of a building, an office building, has a way of breaking down the scale, and also the plan bundling of elements of this massing give a bit of elegance that perhaps one could read as having something in common with Gothic sensibility of an earlier age. Then that truss work has its way of establishing a grand order at the base. And then up in the tower, it's actually a generator of atrium bundles or packets of 3 floors, which are meant for multi-tenant or single-tenant occupancy, but also have a certain energy performance as there's a convection system that uses the rising of hot air in that zone. And also, as it faces north, natural light is in abundance. So certain energy studies were done to justify this or explain it or tune it and engineer it. And in the end, the building, for this and other reasons, is a good, let's say, 50% of what might have been deemed today, we can do better, but might have been deemed earlier, a kind of standard art office building in London. And here you see it in the context of the city. The second project I'm going to show you is in Shanghai, and we think in particular about the street wall, the quality and the scale of surfaces, textures, and architectural designs at the first 3, 4, 5 stories. The project finds itself in Shanghai along one of the best used, best known, most important streets in Shanghai and China, and therefore in the world, Nanjing Road. We know Shanghai best, many of us, first postcards and first visits from the Bund, but Shanghai is a layering of structures and scales back from the Bund, which is thankfully protected in its scale, to rise not just to Pudong, the farm of newly sprouted high-rises, but also, probably more important, to Puxi. And this project is 1 or 2 tiers of scale back in dimension plan, back from the Huangpu River. So we moved back from the Huangpu to this project, which is known as Plaza 66. It's probably the premier office building and retail venue from a commercial point of view in the city of Shanghai, and rises to 300 meters. So the challenge of having such a walloping large building or pair of buildings only 30 meters from a quite intimate street has been handled with the mixing of uses, which is quite common in the architectural challenge and the development logic of that part of the world. And so the street becomes a place where more solid textures in the center and more open volumes at the ends allow for the kind of vitality that Nanjing Road demands or can benefit from as it is built over again with the regrowth of Shanghai. Now, just down the street from Plaza 66 is a very, I think, interesting urban fabric project. It's looking in this direction. This is the Chinese Exhibition Pavilion, a gift from the Russians to the Chinese in the late 50s, early 60s. This is looking from Plaza 66, and we would come to 3 blocks down a project known as Jing'an. It's near a Jing'an temple. Like many projects which our firm and other colleagues working from the United States and doing large structures in China, it's a mixed-use project consisting of hotel, office, retail, entertainment, public space, and mass transit. And the device for composition, both in plan and you'll see volumetrically, is to look at the shikumen or lilong, the sort of indigenous 19th century concession era fabric of this part of Shanghai, most of old Shanghai, which consists of mega blocks or major scale super blocks that are then infiltrated with smaller passageways. They're permeable. One finds squares and interesting spatial moments inside the block, is something we don't normally dream of in the American city. And this project then tries to take in microcosm that order and recreate it as a way also to make sense of the various elements of the mixed-use building. So it's a building up from a vocabulary of smaller cubic elements, and those then come together in a set of open spaces in the middle of the block, and in orange is a tiny house, actually, where Mao Zedong lived in his young, just pre-communist party era, 1920 1920, before the first Congress of the Communist Party. That becomes, in a way, the sort of sacred place in a complex that's tantamount to Rockefeller Center. So it's quite an interesting political irony. But urbanistically and architecturally provides us with a wonderful way to create a reason for and a magnet for a series of open spaces, so that the towers, the scale of the towers, is tamed, is civilized, and is broken down into this kind of gradual ascending of 3 to 5 to 7 to 12 to 60 stories. And then that became a kind of method not only to compose the volumes of the building, but also to create a kind of lexicon of grid types. After all, this is bringing a grid into the composition in plan. And so here you see a construction photo, which is probably now 6 months away from completion. And the employing of exoskeletons and other elements of grid manifestation that can give a richness to a language which could otherwise be more planar and flat is part of the idea. Okay. Now, the third project, another high-rise building, these are all coming up to 300 meters or so. It's a question of texture. This is, again, a mixed-use project of about 5 million square feet, completed a few years ago in Beijing. What you see in purple at the bottom of the image, which look almost like blades of a louver, are 3 office buildings. The analogy to the Louvre is not incidental, because below that is Chang'an Boulevard, or Zhongguo Menwai Lu, which is the sacred axis, east-west axis of Beijing. But it's a highway. And so to create an urban building which might foster some sort of pedestrian activity, to civilize the space inside, is quite a challenge. And that Louvre-like configuration of buildings allows for a spatial contact with Chang'an Boulevard, but also some kind of barrier or protection from. The textural element that I'm referring to is that these mostly glass buildings, and there's a discussion we can have later about glass in high-rises, but at the base of these buildings, a skirting of screens of terracotta becomes a way to recall some of the roof textures, colors of older Beijing buildings, but also to create an element of scale and softness and visual relief, which then creates a garden skirting in the front. In the rear of the building is a series of pocket courtyards of mini urban spaces, of drop-offs and of shopping, coffee shops, etc. So simply the introduction of a more solid texture here of a Chinese manufactured terracotta has been our agent in the scalar exercise. And then finally, issue of public space. Many high-rises have great challenge to understand how the wind drafts and the visual sort of severity of high structures can be mitigated at the base of a building. Rockefeller Center probably serves us as our happiest example of that kind of project. This is a building, however, in Seoul, which is a city which has its own challenges, both high density and, interestingly, sprawl, because there are pockets, and that's partly a topographic issue. This building, this is known as the Lotte Tower, is highly mixed in use. It's a building finding itself in an area which is going to be one of the centers of density already, probably up to 3 or 4 FAR, so it's in a city. But this will look more like a mountain than a single staff sticking up in the next in 20 years or so. The building gestures in its split down the middle towards the older center of Seoul. This is this part of Jamsil, part of Seoul, maybe 10 years ago. And what I want to explain about the structure is that not only at its base, where a series of shopping and cultural uses have been designed also by our firm to go with this 555-meter tower, but there is an attempt to make a vertical city. Now that's something which I probably could show you more effectively in other projects in Japan and Nagoya and Tokyo. But in this case, they've really been sort of sculpted out of and into the architecture of the building. So one could make a parallel, it's a bit whimsical, but to the sequence of public spaces that one finds in the plan of a city here along Regent Street in London. Of course, it's not the same thing, but for the population of the building to think that the place where you shop, where you work, where your hotel room is found, your apartment, entertainment of observation deck activities, and even healthcare, and then down at the base, some of the bubbles would include the largest concert hall in Seoul. All of this is part of the design of a high-rise. And in this case, the architectural themes of curvature, which were the hallmark of the tower plan and section, and the base of the building, and you can see the plan of the larger base at that point, they are carved almost the way a lathe would shape a table leg or a casting would shape a bronze candlestick. As we move up the building, we find a consistent set of these spatially similar efforts recalling the kind of curving, draping, hanging forms. And so that goes from the lobby at the base to semi-public spaces of business conference centers, hotel lobbies, and ultimately residential arrival points and observation decks at the top of the building. So that's a little evidence, I think, at the top of the tower, evidence for our debate and conversation later on about the high-rise. Thanks.
Which one is yours? This?
I don't know.
This? 2012
Yeah, yeah, probably. That's what's this one. Yeah, it is that. Can you not go away for a second because I don't know what's going on. Thank you, Vishan, and thank you, Jamie, for coming. Thank you in general for gracing us with your presence. You're very welcome here, and we appreciate your comments a great deal. And thank you for the specifics of your presentation because they really provide the foil for what I would like to speak about briefly, which has to do with the place of the high-rise building in the city and what constitutes the conditions for understanding high-riseness as an integral part of city making, both in the U.S. and in Asia. I would like to begin by introducing the notion of the hubris of hyperfiguration, and or the temptation to hyperfiguration, and with a small story. About 15 years ago, I was in Princeton to visit my mentor and Liz's mentor, Michael Graves, and I found on his desk two exquisite models, very typical of his work, of two high-rise buildings. And I said, Michael, what are you working on? Oh, and he said, oh, no, I'm just working on salt and pepper shakers for Target. So there is this kind of temptation to understand these objects because of their power, because of their almost magical power, as things in themselves increasingly isolated and self-sufficient in their function and meaning. And I think they can become toys. They can become talismanic manifestations or representations of reality, and happily you can buy them for about $100 for all kinds of historic examples or existing examples in 9-inch cast metal in this particular business, and they're actually delightfully beautiful. But they actually highlight the problem of isolation that is inherent in the current understanding of this building type. I would like to begin my comments by reminding you that there's nothing about high-riseness that has anything to do with density at all. Barcelona, one of my favorite cities in the world, is actually the second densest city in the world, and it is actually up to 7 stories. At 7 stories, it's the second largest city in the world. It has absolutely nothing to do with high-riseness. The two largest high-rise buildings were built for the Olympics and beyond, Probably, I don't remember the exact number, I haven't been in 10 years, but I think there's probably no more than 3 or 4 high-rise buildings in the entire city. What happens when you don't have high-rise buildings in the city is what you see between buildings, which is really the public realm, and what you don't see underneath the buildings, which is an extraordinarily powerful infrastructure of utilities and transportation, are actually making the city possible at every level. They energize the city and they provide a setting in which people can operate fluidly with each other, whether connected to buildings directly or just simply for no purpose at all, just being in the city. So this brings me to the issue of American urbanism and the way in which we understand buildings in the body of the American city. For a building to have urban purpose, it really needs to sit in a block structure that actually renders the entire city through repetition a valid place for the formation of solids, the formation of voids, and the distribution of activities across the entire body of the city. And when you look at the Empire State Building, you have to remind yourself that John D. Rockefeller and his peers and friends at this time, not that he was not responsible for this building, but he was responsible for this definition of the high-rise building of this kind as being really the apogee of the notion of power and the apogee of the idea of the prospect or the possibility of obscene profit. I think those two issues coexist in the idea of a tower, particularly in a city that has a great deal of diversity in terms of the rest of its typology. But when you actually come to an American democratic system of governance and its manifestation as an urban reality, you recognize that the individual interest to actually succeed at an extraordinary level bears with it a level of responsibility for delivering community that's undeniable. In other words, on Fifth Avenue, you have an entrance that's commensurate to the scale of the building and a continuous retail base that's accessible to all citizens. John D. and his friends might be on the 101st floor, but the ground floor belongs to the city. As you turn the corner onto 34th Street, this continues at even more modest basis. As you actually understand the building as an object in the city, it is actually thoroughly integrated to the point that the base is not only a functional aspect of the composition, but it's actually an absolutely powerful, independent, formal aspect of the composition. The building is divided into parts to such an extent that the tower only exists as skyline. The tower does not exist as ground floor. And you only find the tower if you crank up your head in a thoroughly impossible urban way, because if you did this for more than 10 seconds, you'd be running into somebody or you would be killing yourself or falling down. So really the field of vision and the understanding of the city in a mixed-type city of this kind is one where the base is virtually self-sufficient. And then I would like to suggest that the issue of toys and the issue of egos, whether of the maker or the receiver of this kind of extraordinary thing, gets transformed in our great American cities into a game of where is Waldo. Because in fact, the most amazing thing about this image is that you can't find the Empire State Building. You can't see it. It doesn't exist. It exists powerfully as a skyline, but it does not exist as fabric. It doesn't stand out. It is part of the whole in an amazing way. So on that basis, I would like to suggest that in new urbanist terms, and fully understanding the utopian position that Vishaan outlined, that all density and all growth has to happen at the upper end of a spectrum, I think in this country, under present conditions, there is going to be both continuing development and extensive redevelopment and further development across an entire spectrum, for reasons that I can neither defend nor can I explain in about 10 seconds. But the fact is that there is an extraordinary range of possible intensities, one of which is the metropolitan intensity, within which a variety of types can be had, including towers. And I think some towers are vertical cul-de-sacs and some are not. This would be my position as a new urbanist. And some of you have seen these diagrams from the CNU in Austin, but I would like to repeat them. Some of them are and some are not. And these are the criteria that make some towers of one kind and others of another. When the towers project a collective form, then they're urban objects. When they're isolated and stand off by themselves and violate the skyline of a city, then they are not. When a tower can stand in a block, and it has to be part of the block, because the block is the mediating structure between individual object and public realm, either it is by itself, at which point it violates the city, or it is so broken down that it can coexist with other objects of different times, different hands, and different intensities. In terms of massing, I think that can manifest itself in a situation on the left where buildings are actually are expressed as styles on growing or sinking to the ground, as opposed to things that have enough volumetric compositional power at different parts of their bodies that they can make a whole with their neighbors. They're compatible, in other words, as opposed to precluding compatibility. I think the issue of ground floor access is absolutely irresistible. I think the entire state building speaks oodles about this. I think whether you are in a brownstone or in a small commercial building or in a skyscraper, every 25 feet in the city, there needs to be some relief to the city wall. Otherwise, you're excluded from the life of the city. You become a person without a purpose in the city. You're kept out. And finally, I think the question of public realm. Buildings that are set back from the city, that exclude the city, that separate themselves from the city, that they don't make the public space of the city, whether the public space on the ground or, as in the case of the High Line, in the air, those kinds of buildings are un-urban building, disurban building, and really destroy the city. So it's terribly important to understand that the various scales of the city, of buildings, up to 4, 5, 6 stories, depending where they are and how they are, and depending on the nature of cities, their histories, their realities, these lower scales are the ones that make the pedestrian space possible. And finally, I would say the final criterion for me of the difference between cul-de-sacs and real urban objects is that if you make buildings that have 8 stories of parking in their base, you're building sprawl, Austin, and there should not really be a tower that actually has any parking in it, as far as I'm concerned, in order to truly become an urban object. So I would like to claim Manhattan for the new urbanism. Actually, I would like to claim Manhattan for American urbanism, because it is really an extraordinary urban reality in which the public realm and those very amazing, simple and elegant blocks can sustain houses, row houses, commercial buildings of all kinds, and this mammoth, this behemoths that actually can coexist with all other objects and make for the kind of amazing place, the pinnacle of urbanism in our country that Manhattan is. And there is nothing inconsistent about this view of Manhattan I just outlined and the operative theory of new urbanist coding, because in our practice, at least, under form-based codes, we understand the city as being a kind of chess game with about 12 or 15 pieces on a gridiron, and where developers, depending on the zone that they are in the body of the city, can choose types, among them the tower, and actually place them in a way where these buildings can have their own presence and be compatible with all others. And in our codes, and this is a double-page code that explains the typological nature of towers for a small California city, the city of Fresno, you can describe in about 6 or 7 simply prescriptive ways what a tower should do in order to be an acceptable object in the body of a city. And this actually is the zoning code for Fresno. We have 1 more year to go before it's approved, but in fact the Republican mayor of Fresno said that the purpose of this code, the metric for her that would make it acceptable to her, is somebody who could come to Fresno, want to build a 15 or 20-story tower, and it could be 80 or 100-story tower in Seoul or in London, and that this project could be approved in 30 days. This was the measure of it. And there is no reason for this project to not be approved in 30 days if it meets the requirements that I outlined before. Now, I want to speak about a very painful subject because I'm an immigrant. I believe in the development rights of all peoples of the world. And I believe in the independence, the political and social independence of all peoples of the world. But I think something has happened in our society that is worth noting. And this is another picture of the bund in Shanghai. After 50 years of thinking about it, I've come to the conclusion that colonialism might have been the work of the evil empire in any other way other than architecture and urbanism. Because the colonial powers went to the rest of the world, be it Australia, China, or South America, and put in place a place and climate-specific architecture and urbanism that actually attempted to become the means of expression of that place. This is very counterintuitive because colonialism has been extractive in 1,000 ways and abusive in 1,000 ways. But in terms of architecture and urbanism, it encouraged that each place in the world be unique and special. Two things happened to upset this kind of regime. The first one was modernist urbanism. And what you see here is this very famous photograph of the hand of God, Le Corbusier, directing the Plan Voisin of Paris in 1919, I believe. And what this did, what the whole idea of Siam-braced urbanism, which is expressed so extraordinarily, in the work of Le Corbusier through his book, The Ville Radieuse, the Radiant City, is that the components of the city, the constituent components of the city, are simply unglued and separated from each other. Infrastructure, public space, public landscape, and buildings are actually completely detached from each other, and that building types, the historical ones, the socially relevant ones, the ones that actually made society the way it was through dozens of centuries, are erased, and the whole world is turned into a FAIA casino. And not only is that hand, the hand of God, Le Corbusier, the one that is allowed in place, it's also the hand of every other architect who also becomes an equal hand to his and is now enabled to actually place the object of their desire on the city with an equal claim to uniqueness and with equal claim to extraordinary character and quality. This actually is, in a sense, the birth of architecture, the birth of the individual maker being somehow morally obliged and morally superior in making one building, expressing themselves at the expense of expressing either a relationship to nature or a relationship to the city. The other issue, which I think is very important to address here, is actually the rise of the communist state. I have absolutely no illusions in my mind, none whatsoever, that we're dealing here with a dictatorial regime, a ruthless regime, a corrupt regime, and a regime that is on the one hand trying to help its people without any question, but actually looking after the interests of the minority that rules it. There is nothing that has changed in China, nothing at all, between the way it was 20, 40, and 60 years ago. And I think the fact is that it is very difficult to place architecture and urbanism that comes out of a context of an open, democratic, and a society in the tensions of the daily friction of the societies into the hands of people who are actually basically articulating their interest and their interest alone, even with the best of intentions. Which brings me to how we make buildings for these countries. And I'm speaking, and I excuse my colleagues, I'm speaking in very general terms here. The subject is infinite in its depth, and I'm using the work of my colleagues at Gensler, with whom I'm working on a couple of projects right now in the United States. One has to address the question of the absolute clarity, the great elegance, the amazing poetry of some of these buildings. This is a project of Gensler in Shanghai, where they're actually taking a high-rise building, draping it in 2 layers of glass, and separating functionally into 6 or 7 pieces, and every piece has its own lobby, and each lobby is this kind of double space in the air. It's a stunning idea, the most beautiful thing you can possibly imagine. And then my teeth begin to clatter when I read in the brochure that this is actually understood as the self-contained city. That in itself is so anti-urban and disurban that you know the red flags begin to flutter in my mind. And then when you actually see this thing, when you see this thing located in the city and what it does to the city, all of a sudden you see very clearly not only the architect but also the state that sponsored it had fallen into the deep hole of the temptation of overfiguration. So you have an object that's sitting on a ground that literally erases the city and pushes it out and destroys any sense of understanding about how objects of this magnitude and this importance begin to actually make the world around them. This is a cul-de-sac. This building is a cul-de-sac in the middle of the city. And there is, I mean, in this brochure, it's described in all kinds of ways that actually make that point more and more and more and more and more clear. And then when you find yourself in pieces of the city that have this kind of configuration and this kind of separation and this kind of discombobulation and this kind of adherence to the rules of modernist urbanism in the Siam mode, you recognize that what is behind this is not only an aesthetic, but there's also an ethic. And it's the ethic of it that I find completely intolerable. The aesthetic I can certainly appreciate and even love, but the ethic is an ethic of control, it's an ethic of dividing and ruling, and an ethic that simply does not allow people to occupy their own place in the world. And the incredible thing, because I've had just more than dozens of extraordinary Chinese students as a professor of architecture, the extraordinary thing is that this is not a problem of the communist regime alone. It's a problem of imperial Chinese culture going back 20 centuries. Because there is no word, there's no typological expression in China that deals with figural space at all. There's no tradition of space making. And what happens is that everything, therefore, turns into an absolute joke. Even Maxims of Paris is actually a label, not a place, not an experience, not an institution, not a presence of extraordinary elevated taste, but a red band with a service class in front of it. And therefore, in the most pathetic way, the city becomes not a reality, but it becomes basically a slogan, which actually, basically, I think, serves the purposes, the ideological purposes of this regime. And I will go back to I will go to these 3 photographs and show you that when you're in New York, the issue of towers just disappears. Just disappears. It appears only when you're on 40th and 60th floors, or you can look at the skyline from far. When you're in the city, it is really the public space of the city that matters. Architecture is about buildings, and urbanism is about the space in between. And the fact is that this space is a space of freedom. I'm going to sound like a member of the Tea Party. Is a space of freedom. It's a space of fashion. It's a place of free interaction. It's a place of commercial exchange. It's the space of change. It's the space of tension. It's the space of meeting the unknown. It's the space of making tomorrow. That's what this picture says to me. This picture says to me, icing of public activity, control, determinism, no future for anybody but those that actually have their hand on the levers of power. It is time, I think, to begin to stop about function and FARs and abstractions of policy and start looking at objects symbolically. Start looking at them within their typological range and in relationship to the society that they serve, trying to understand what they mean. So, is it possible that these buildings that stand a mile away from these buildings can serve the same purpose? And the answer is no. The answer is that these towers are not, I'm sorry, I can read very well. The tower is symbolic of a nation whose future is filled with limitless opportunities. This is not what this is. This is a slogan. What this is a progress toy. It is a progress toy. It is meant to justify the presence of this regime, and it is meant to actually serve certain purposes that do not have to do with true city building of the kind that my colleague spoke about, certainly in the case of democratic countries, of the democratic countries of the West. So I would like to bring forth the subject that capital in one country and capital in another country, history in one country and history in another country, political control in one country and political control in another country do matter, and they do matter when they're different from each other, and they do matter in the way in which they make the world in which the peoples of these countries live. And the fact that things look the same in both countries is a problem, I think, that we need to come to grips with and do something about it, and urgently. Thank you very much.
Jamie and Vishan, can you come up and sit down? So, sorry. We were a little bit slow getting going, and we don't have much time. But so I'm going to very quickly run through a couple of things, setting up some of the questions, and then we'll go on to questions. So we started with this image from the Financial Times, which, when you start to study it, you realize that these are the existing New York buildings down here, and these are the new buildings up here. It is a seductive image, there's no question, but it's also, I think, worth pointing out that it is an image of what today we're calling the 1%. That, you know, that this is the financial world we're talking about, and this is the image around the world of where Goldman and Walmart want to land their jets. They want to have a building with a big trading floor and that sort of thing. And then Rem Koolhaas pointed out, he took all the same buildings and he put them in Dubai, and he said, and in saying this, he also blocked out his own building. He said, the work we do is no longer mutually reinforcing, but I would say that any accumulation is counterproductive to the point that each new addition reduces the sum's value. This is an image of the financial institutions of the city in London, I think making the point that they don't add up together to urbanism. They are individual objects. This is a quote from Vishan's old boss, Amanda Burden, and I must say it's a very good statement, and I think also a very bad statement. Design is, she said, frankly, part of a long-term strategy for New York City to compete on the global stage. Great design, innovative, challenging design keeps the city young and vibrant and compelling. It shows that a city, importantly, is open to change, entrepreneurial thinking, and creative engagement. Density, diversity, tolerance, and aspiration are all quintessential New York City qualities that are translated through the language of city design and are key to attracting city investment. And I have to agree on one level, but I also have to say that this is a building by Frank Gehry next to a building by Jean Nouvel. And any New Yorker, not just, our very good planning commissioner, who is a devotee of Holly White, knows that this is bad urbanism, that, to paraphrase Kunstler, all the Valium in the world couldn't make you happy walking along this block. And it's, you know, we know that, and yet at the same time we are saying, oh, this is wonderful. Our city is saying this is wonderful, this is what we want. And last night we heard Richard Florida talking about the importance of placemaking and why the creative class wants placemaking and why that is what brings them to cities. And he, I was somewhat surprised to hear, was somewhat negative about towers, and he quoted this essay from Ed McMahon at the URLI, also talking about placemaking and not going too high. And you know, I think they're talking about what Stefanos was talking about, the space between the buildings, the connection to the ground, the connection to the sky and the sunlight. And as someone born in New York and who's left New York, come back to New York more than once, I certainly am not someone who, I am not against towers. But I do understand this, well, we have to move ahead. So let me say, what New Urbanists are about is placemaking. And when a tower gets in the way of placemaking, it's something that the Congress for New Urbanism does not want to support. And it's noticeable in New York that periodically places like Time Out will do, you know, what's the best street in New York? What's the best block in New York? And it is always, without exception, an old block. It'll be something like Portland in South Brooklyn. And when I was a kid, I remember walking around Midtown, and it was primarily a masonry, medium-rise city. And every now and then a new building like Lever House or Seagram's would come along, and they were very interesting additions to the fabric. But now we've reached the point where Midtown, where the glass boxes are not the interesting additions, they're the norm, and the streets simply are not as good a place as they used to be. And now we're talking about upzoning Park Avenue to make bigger trading floors, all glass buildings. And I think this is one question we'll get to, is why is it always glass? But let's get to questions from the audience. Does someone have a question?
Is there a mic someplace?
I think you'll hear me. Never had a problem. I guess not for Stefanos, but for the first two speakers. Maybe a little bit of a comment and a question. You can be a liberal and live in a single-family house, by the way. You can stipulate to the idea that density is probably, the way you describe it, is probably a good thing in some places, and it's probably okay to have high-rises in some places. But my concern with what both of you showed was that there was actually a disconnection between what you talked about and the passion for your buildings, which was clear, and what might actually happen across the street or down the street. And I think that's really what a lot of New Urbanists are concerned about. Stefanos described it to some extent as the relationship between the tower and the base, but it's also the tower and the city. And so, yeah, you can do it, and we've got in New York is a great example. But my God, I mean, it's disconcerting. The fins that you described. Imagine you were one block behind those fins. You've actually created a wall between you and what was, in a sense, what was there. Places that I work for, that I've been design codes for, if I actually created a code that allowed that, I would be fired very quickly. Not because they were tall, but because of that disconnection. So that was kind of a comment that you can respond. That wasn't a question. Respond.
I think you made a...
Yeah, you do have a mic.
commenting about a specific design, I think. I'm not sure what you're referring to. If I can help you. Oh, I see. I see. Those are they're buildings, actually. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Do you know Beijing?
Yeah.
And you know that part of Beijing?
Yeah, but yes, and I still don't buy it.
Well, I'm not asking you to buy anything, but haven't placed, given you a proposal, or a proposition, but it's a part of Beijing where there is essentially no city plan to begin with. And I think as architects or critics or landscape designers, whatever we are all in the room, some planners, we have to start with some challenges that are based in current land configurations, zoning laws, economics, etc. So that part of Beijing is being designed and being built as a series of superblocks. There's no, that's a fact. It's just the way any of us might take on a New York site, which have a row house, which might be 25 foot wide and 60 foot deep. And so one's responsibility is to create a kind of urbanism within the superblock that will not necessarily be answered by the next superblock or the next, because we can only deal in these quanta of about 20, 30, 40 acres. And so the challenge then, it might be a similar challenge one could face in an American city if one had bigger land parcels, let's say in LA, of building off of a highway. How do you start to break down the scale or to make a nice place for people to occupy a park or to walk from building to building where there is no connection made from one side of the highway to the next in the middle of the city? So they're a complex series of issues which you may understand but you may not understand in making these critiques. And I think what I believe we and other architects like us trying to do in Beijing is to create a kind of hierarchy of spaces and a kind of humane street experience. At the same time wrestling with some pretty gargantuan problems of giant arteries, of superblocks, and we don't have the advantage, I think Stefanos talked about, that axonometric, or maybe it was an aerial view of New York City looking down at the Empire State Building. For so many in all of these projects, it's a question really of the fabric that we're given to start with. Where we cannot impose so easily the same or create the same kind of sensitive transitions and microfabrics that we have to start next to a 18-lane highway. And that is our Fifth Avenue. That is our Michigan Avenue. That's in Beijing. That's where you start. So those fins were an attempt at a master planning and macro architectural level to try to establish a boundary that is permeable. And I haven't had a chance to show you the way the plan works. If I showed you a NOLI plan, you'd understand you can actually filter between the buildings through from linear strip to internal park, et cetera, et cetera. But I think I can understand your emotions, but I'm not sure you understand what you're critiquing, simply because you haven't had a chance to learn about it. About
That's part of the issue. You didn't actually present what you just described. You gave us the pretty pictures, but not urbanism.
Well, I'm sorry, but we had 15 minutes to talk about a big subject, and perhaps I should have, I shouldn't have come to talk to you about it. But I'm just trying to explain that there is a lot. You have to use your imagination a little bit instead of pouncing on something which you might not know about anything about. And Vishan, maybe you have some comments that are more helpful. Sorry, I can't be more helpful.
Liz?
How much time do we have?
what I agree with is that historically you could, right? But I think we live under a very different set of conditions today. When I worked for the city, I met my counterpart from Paris, and we were planning for the Hudson Yards in various parts of Manhattan. She explained to me that Paris basically, after they passed the ban on towers and so forth, and in the 10 years since that, has lost about 160,000 jobs to Lille, to Frankfurt, and to London. And that fundamentally, you can look at a place like Paris or Barcelona, which is true that on the numbers are very, very dense places. I don't dispute that for a moment. But there are tremendous questions about whether that kind of morphology supports anything that has to do with the modern economy. And so I disagree in the sense that I think when one talks about density going into the future, that somehow this is not about towers. Also, if you look at dense European cities that people love, there's a couple of things that one must understand about them, right? One is that fundamentally they are constructed of real estate that was also built around, I think, power and obscene profit to build the colonial symbols that are so reprehensible around the world. But that you also need to understand that in the preservation of those pure, dense, quite beautiful forms in places like Barcelona and Paris, we have the result of these extraordinary slums that have now defined the outskirts of European cities. And so, I think it's important to look at questions like that both in history as well as in the modern context.
Can I respond to that for a second? Because I think maybe, Liz, you can change the subject if you wish. My take on the slums of European cities, and the peripheries of cities, is that these are places where the states have invested heavily since the Second World War, with disastrous results because of precisely the issues we've been talking about. And I think if these in Barcelona, for instance, which I know intimately, and in Paris, if the banlieues had been resolved over the same period of time with a very diverse fabric, not excluding towers, I think those would not be throwaway places. And I think the problem is that the evidence of the last 50 years is that tower and freeway city in Western Europe is a toxic place. And that the fact is that we're witnessing a situation where planners are insisting that this continue to be the case, whether they're in Beijing, in the old Soviet Union, or in Western Europe, and actually people are running away from those kinds of places in one form or the other, whether leaving them to immigrants or just simply abandoning them. And I think the greatest and the most interesting aspect of this discussion is not the low-rise city versus the high-rise city versus the intermediate city, but it's a city made of all those things together. That is the lesson of this extraordinary axonometric of New York. It is really about more than one density, more than one choice, more than one place, more, and more. And I think this is something we need to try someplace. And I want to tell you of a personal frustration that as a member of this Congress, having worked in the urban realm for 20 years, 30 almost actually, we have never gotten a chance to do this, because somehow we've been relegated, as our landscape architect friends call it, to flyover country, and we are actually being kept out as a series of interests in design out of metropolitan areas, by and large. And I think there's enormous opportunity in trying to make a difference in rethinking how these pieces fit together. I'm sorry, Liz. Liz, I'm sorry I've taken so long.
Why don't you go and then I'll go?
Right. And again, I think you're, it's a little hard for me to know exactly which projects you were referring to, but in general, I think I catch your drift. And I feel espouse or try to practice in these projects many of the kinds of goals that you're articulating. I think, and we could talk about that further. It's a matter of what one has designed and built and specifics of design. But I think it's worth noting for all of us that the radically different ground rules or the conditions of some of the locations that I was talking about, or if I only talked about 5, then could talk about another 10 of equally differing locations in Tokyo, Hong Kong, London, Paris, New York, etc. And I think it's the danger in this discussion, as it is so short by necessity, we're referring to some pretty broad sets of issues of architectural typology, of urban design conditions or urban fabric conditions, and they are bound to get confused with each other. And we all know these are very, very contextual sets of issues. They're historically, economically, ideologically, iconographically, whatever. They're very, very specific. But so I just want to, before Vishan makes a comment, I just want to mention an environment I didn't talk about, but I think John meant to discuss somehow in the session, which is Hong Kong. Because many of the buildings that I haven't had anything to do with designing, and that are so radically not about the single street level, the texture of facade that rewards one in the same way that a New York City street or a Chicago street or some of our well-loved streets in this country, or London, Paris, et cetera, they're kind of almost calling out a different set of anthropological responses from their users than the ones that I think most of us in the room are used to. And yet they are quite successful as judged by their users, their, the prominent citizens, their critics, etc. The bridge and tunnel, or mostly bridge and bridge, world of Hong Kong it violates all the rules that most of us were educated to respect. And yet they function in a fascinating way. It's hard to say that they're not that they are not for the public good. And so I think in these conversations, which, I'm sorry? There's both. There's street life. It's because of the section of the topography that the ground becomes the bridge. But I just mean to say that it's really hard to make sense, hard to make progress in the conversation about such broadly differing sets of goals and conditions, simply because we're all trying to work and respond to something quite specific. And Hong Kong is a great example. No, but I think we could talk about Hong Kong, and then let's talk about Hong Kong. You want to talk about Paris? Let's talk about Paris. And La Défense, I don't also. It's too bad there's a podium between us, because I think there's a lot that we can agree about. In this discussion, I think of course, Stefanos, what you're saying is quite right about the suburban housing projects of Paris. Architecture did create social dysfunction, and it had something to do with that hand. I think Pudong is a huge problem, which the Chinese now understand. Their planners goofed. They did something too quickly. I talked to Wu Jiang, the lead planner of Shanghai today, who says, well, we just did it because we had to do something quickly, and we put 5 competition schemes into the blender. We came out with an answer, but at least it's progress. But they don't believe it's the answer, and the new planning edicts of Shenzhen and other cities are moving in a different direction. So I think these critiques are good. I just don't think they should be so absolute as not to understand some of what Pudong achieved. It's not my favorite part of Shanghai by any stretch. And, you know, La Défense is a very, very weird thing. At least they kept the growth outside of those buildings outside of Paris. But I think, well, I said enough, I think. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, look, Liz, I very much appreciate the tone of your question because I think, I mean, and actually, I was hoping you were going to show Nusong-do. Jamie worked on this project outside of Seoul. It's a very large new city project that has high towers and low towers and extremely deftly done ground plane, which I left out of my presentation in the hopes that you were going to do it. But I need to implore something of the audience and of the panelists, because I really came down here to try to have as open mind as possible, feeling that there's actually a lot of common cause. And one of the things I did not want to do is take cheap shots. So, for instance, I did not want to look at Seaside and say it's for the 1%. Right? I did not want to repeat criticisms I've heard of CNU about it being racist. Right? I did not want to do that. It's disappointing, I have to say, to come down and feel the cheap shots. That picture is an image on a highway. You cannot make retail survive there. You cannot make, it is a highway. And it is a better looking highway than most highways in America. Right? The image of the skyline that has been shown repeatedly from FT completely blurs, and purposefully so, the unbelievable work that Amanda Burden and her colleagues have done to build some of the most extraordinary public space around high rises and low rises and mid rises throughout New York City. Right? Purposefully we showed, you know, public space that my firm is doing, that other firms are doing. We talked about the High Line. I think if you want to be invited to this conversation, Stefanos, then you have to have a more open mind about these things. You cannot make statements like there is no tradition of space making in China. That's a staggering statement. I go to a lot of conferences. I've never heard people who claim to be students of history. That's a direct quote.
Oh, it is. Actually,
I find it astonishing. I've been going to China since 1992. Some of the spaces in the Hutongs and the Lilongs of China are some of the most beautiful, poetic spaces I've been to in my life. I find it astonishing you would say that. I find it astonishing that you would defend colonial architecture as symbols, right? You know, because it just, the tone has to change if we're going to have this conversation in a real way. So I just want to say, Liz, I appreciate the tone of your question.
Well, perhaps I did not speak clearly enough what I really meant to say, and I would very much like to continue to discuss with you, because these are, I'm not a student of Chinese architecture or urbanism, but I've had many students who are Chinese that I've worked with very closely and who are back in China working. And I should have said more precisely, there's no Chinese tradition of public space.
That's also untrue.
Well,
the gardens are unbelievable. You know, Stefanos, it makes me so angry because, you know, I went to an event last year in New York where Jack Robertson, who's a friend, whom I respect very much, talked about the horrors of Chinese building, of Chinese cities. He then, at the end of a 20-minute tirade in front of a group of Chinese, said, I haven't been to China in 47 years. It's irresponsible.
Well, I would like to continue to talk about with you if I could, because this is a subject I want to pursue further.
We should talk about it.
Thank
further.
you.